Dyatlov Pass Incident, the unexplainable night in the Ural Mountains. New theories about the tragic and mysterious end of 9 hikers. Part 1: the slope, the tent, and the night that broke the silence. There are some mysteries that feel as though they were designed by nature itself. No witnesses, no survivors, no final confession. Just snow, distance, silence, and a set of clues so disturbing that every generation tries to solve them again. The Dyatlov Pass Incident is one of those stories. It begins in the winter of 1959 in the Soviet Union with a group of young hikers who were not reckless amateurs, not thrill seekers chasing danger for spectacle, but skilled, disciplined trekkers from the Ural Polytechnical Institute. Their expedition was considered a high difficulty route for the time, and most of them were experienced skiers and hikers preparing for one of the highest certification levels then available in Soviet trekking. Their leader was 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov, a radio engineering student whose name would later be given to the mountain pass forever linked to their deaths. There were 10 in the group when the journey began. Young men and women with notebooks, cameras, heavy clothing, skis, route plans, and that particular kind of confidence shared by people who know hardship but still believe they can master it. They left Sverdlovsk in late January 1959 and headed north toward the wilderness of the northern Urals. One of them, Yuri, turned back early because of worsening joint pain and illness. That decision saved his life. The other 9 went on without him into the cold. Yudin would spend the rest of his life carrying the unbearable burden of being the only one who returned. That is one of the reasons the story hit so hard. Because it does not begin with people who seem doomed. It begins with energy, with photographs, with jokes on the trail, with diary entries, with the ordinary optimism of a group that still thinks the journey ahead is difficult, but possible. Recovered film and journals later allowed investigators to reconstruct much of their route up to the final day. On February 1, 1959, the 9 hikers pitched their large tent on the eastern slope of Kholat Sek, a mountain whose name in the Mansi language is often rendered as a dead mountain. They were not yet at their destination, but they made camp on the exposed slope rather than retreating into the forest below, most likely to avoid losing altitude or wasting time the next morning. The last known photograph appears to show members of the group cutting into the snow slope to prepare the tent site. That detail, once minor, would become central decades later. Try to picture that final evening. The light thinning. The cold settling harder by the minute. Snow driven by wind across a white slope. A canvas tent rising against the mountainside. 9 experienced hikers finishing the kind of work that feels routine when you still believe the next morning will come like any other. Someone adjusts the tent line. Someone packs away a notebook. Someone stamps snow from a boot. Someone laughs at something small and forgettable. And all around them, the Ural Mountains remain indifferent. This is what makes wilderness tragedies so haunting. The landscape never announces which night will become the last ordinary one. When the group did not return on time, concern did not become alarm immediately. Delays on difficult winter expeditions were not unusual. But when February passed without contact, families and officials pressed for a search. Rescue teams began looking for the hikers, first with volunteers and later with broader official support. On February 26, searchers found the tent. It was partially collapsed, half buried in snow and abandoned. What they saw there would echo through decades of speculation. The tent appeared to have been cut open from the inside. Shoes, clothing, and essential gear had been left behind. Whatever had driven the hikers out, it had done so with such urgency that they fled into the dark and cold without taking what they needed to survive. That image alone is enough to create a legend. A tent on a mountainside, sliced open from within. The people inside gone. Their boots still there. Their warm clothing still there. The storm already beginning to erase their last moments. The investigators found footprints leading away from the tent toward the tree line more than a kilometer downslope. These were not the tracks of a chaotic stampede in every direction. They suggested that the group moved away on foot, some apparently in socks, some barefoot, some with only a single shoe. The tracks eventually disappeared beneath drifting snow. At the edge of the forest, beneath a large Siberian cedar, searchers found the first 2 bodies, Yuri Doroshenko and Georgy Krivonishenko. They were poorly dressed for the conditions, near the remains of a small fire. Broken branches high in the cedar suggested someone had climbed the tree, perhaps trying to see the tent or survey the slope through darkness and wind. It is one of the most chilling scenes in modern mystery. A fire in the snow. 2 men dead beside it. A tree stripped and scarred above them. And beyond that tree, somewhere up the slope, the abandoned tent still standing in the night like a question no one could answer. Between the cedar and the tent, 3 more bodies were discovered over the next stretch of ground. Igor Dyatlov, Sineda Kolmogorova, and Rustam Slobodin. Their positions suggested movement back toward the camp, as though some of them had tried to return uphill after reaching the shelter of the forest. The picture that emerged was not of instant death, but of a desperate sequence, a retreat from the tent, an attempt to survive below, and then a fatal effort by some members to make it back to the gear they had abandoned. The mountain was not simply where they died. It was where they kept trying to undo whatever had gone wrong. At that stage, the tragedy was already terrible, but it was not yet truly strange. That came later. The remaining 4 bodies were not found until May, buried beneath deep snow in a ravine farther into the woods. And these victims, Lyudmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, Nikolai Thibault-Sprignol, and Alexander Kovatov, changed the tone of the case completely. Some were better dressed than the first bodies, suggesting that clothing had been redistributed among the group as the situation worsened. But the injuries shocked investigators. Thibault-Sprignol had major skull damage. Dubinina and Zolotaryov had severe chest trauma. Some bodies had missing eyes, and Dubinina was found without her tongue. The injuries seemed far beyond ordinary hypothermia, yet they were not accompanied by the kind of obvious external wounds people expected from a violent attack. And that is the moment when the Dyatlov Pass story crossed from tragedy into mythology. Because once people hear that detail like cut tent, bodies scattered in the snow, missing eyes, crushed ribs, and missing tongue, the imagination begins doing what it always does when the truth isn't complete. It starts inventing things. The Soviet inquest in 1959 concluded that the hikers had died because of a compelling or unknown natural force. That phrase solved nothing. It was both official and vague, formal and empty. Worse still, the Soviet state did not create trust around the case. It was a secretive system, and mystery inside a secretive system almost always generates darker theories than mystery in the open. Over time, the Dyatlov Pass Incident became a magnet for every kind of explanation. Military testing, secret weapons, a clash with Mansi hunters, escaped prisoners, infrasound, katabatic wind, paranormal forces, ball lightning, and even extraterrestrials. But before the theories, there was the simple human horror. 9 young people had gone into the mountains. They left behind photographs that looked almost joyful. Then their tent was found ripped open from within. Their bodies were discovered in stages, as if the mountain had chosen to reveal them one chapter at a time. That is why the case has never really left public imagination. It is not only the violence of the deaths. It is the sequence. The way the clues appear to tell a story and then suddenly refuse to continue. What happened between the moment they settled into that tent and the moment they fled it? This is the central wound of the Dyatlov mystery, because the cut from inside tells us they wanted out fast. The abandoned boots tell us they left under extreme pressure. The ordered footprints suggest they were not instantly chaotic. The fire under the cedar suggests they tried to survive rationally. The bodies positioned uphill suggest at least some hope to return. The better clothed victims in the ravine suggest resourcefulness, not total madness. And yet the injuries and exposure show that reason, courage, and experience were not enough. There is something almost unbearable in that. They were not fools. They were not untrained. They did not simply lie down and surrender. They seemed to have fought for one another, shed clothing, built a fire, tried to move, tried to return. This matters, because one of the cruelest side effects of famous wilderness mysteries is that the dead are often reduced to symbols. They become the victims in the bizarre case. But these were real people, and the best modern scientific work on the incident has, in a strange way, restored some dignity to them. It suggests that the group may not have been irrational at all. They may have been responding logically to a rare and very specific disaster in conditions so brutal that no logic could fully save them. Still, in 1959, none of that was clear. All investigators had was aftermath. 6 of the 9 were ultimately determined to have died primarily of hypothermia. Others suffered severe blunt trauma. The combination felt impossible to reconcile. To many observers, the injury sounded more like a vehicle collision than a mountain accident. The missing soft tissue looked monstrous. The Soviet conclusion sounded evasive. And so, with no survivor to explain the night and no trustworthy narrative from the authorities, the mystery hardened into something deeper than a case file. It became folklore. And folklore is dangerous, because once a story enters folklore, it stops belonging only to evidence. It begins belonging to fear, politics, and whatever each era most wants to project into darkness. During the Cold War, people imagined secret weapons. In later decades, with television and tabloids hungry for spectacle, the story welcomed Yetis, UFO, and hidden Soviet cover-ups. The emptier the official answer felt, the more crowded the mystery became. But beneath all of that noise, the real scene remained frozen in place. A tent on a slope, a rushed escape, a march to the forest, a fire, 3 bodies on the return route, 4 more in the ravine under deep snow, and a final night with no witness except the mountain. That is where part 1 ends. Not with a solution, not even with the dominant theory, but with the image that made the Dyatlov Pass Incident immortal. 9 experienced hikers on a winter slope in the northern Urals, fleeing their own tent into sub-zero darkness for reasons still debated more than 6 decades later. Dyatlov Pass Incident, the unexplainable night in the Ural Mountains. Part 2, new theories, old fears, and the mountain that refused to explain itself. The power of the Dyatlov Pass mystery does not come only from what happened. It comes from how many things seem almost true. A military test feels possible because it was the Soviet Union. An avalanche feels possible because they were on a mountain. A wind event feels possible because the weather was savage. Panic feels possible because the tent was cut open from inside. Survival strategy feels possible because they built a fire and tried to return. And because each explanation can hold one part of the puzzle, the entire story has remained suspended between reason and myth for generations. For many years, the most dramatic theories got the most attention. People spoke of secret military experiments, partly because the Soviet state was secretive enough to make such ideas feel plausible. Others pointed to reports of glowing orange spheres in the sky from around that time and place. Some imagined an attack by Nazi hunters, or by escaped prisoners, or by some hidden armed patrol. But the official records never established evidence of a third-party assault at the campsite, and later reviews focused increasingly on natural explanations rather than homicide. That does not mean every detail was neatly resolved. It means the most enduring modern work on the case has shifted away from murder and toward environment, terrain, and snow physics. That shift matters. Because once you leave the world of conspiracies and re-enter the world of mountains, the story begins to look different. Not less frightening, but more believable, and in some ways more tragic. In 2019, Russian authorities reopened the case and narrowed the field of explanation to natural causes. In 2020, the new inquiry concluded that an avalanche and poor visibility were the key factors. According to the official account, the hikers were forced out of their tent by snow movement and then, unable to see properly in severe conditions, failed to make it back. Reuters reported that the inquiry blamed an avalanche and loss of visibility, and quoted the deputy regional prosecutor saying there had been no panic, but no real chance of survival under the circumstances. That official conclusion did not end the mystery. In fact, for many people, it did the opposite, because the avalanche theory had always faced serious objections. The slope above the tent did not look steep enough at first glance. Searchers had not reported obvious giant avalanche debris. The injuries seemed strange for standard avalanche victims, and the timing appeared awkward. If the hikers cut into the slope when they made camp, why would the disaster wait so long to happen? These objections kept the public suspicious, and for many viewers of the case, the official explanation felt too plain for such a haunting story. Then came one of the most important modern developments in the entire Dyatlov story. In 2021, researchers Joan Gorman and Alexander Pazun published a study in Communications, Earth and Environment proposing a physical mechanism for a small delayed slab avalanche. The work did not claim to solve every feature of the mystery, but it did something far more important. It showed, with actual snow mechanics, how an avalanche-like event could happen there despite the objections that had kept people skeptical for decades. The study argued that a combination of irregular topography, the cut the hikers made into the slope to pitch the tent, and wind-driven snow accumulation above them could have created a delayed slab release several hours later. This was a turning point, because it replaced the vague word avalanche with a much more precise idea. Not a giant roaring wall of snow sweeping the mountain bare. Not a cinematic disaster visible for miles, but a relatively small slab release, local, delayed. and capable of striking the tent hard enough to force the group out, injure some of them, and then disappear into subsequent snowfall and terrain irregularities. According to the 2021 paper, the average slope angle had misled earlier observers because the terrain around the tent was irregular. A locally steeper section, together with the buried weak layer and the snow cut made during campsite preparation, could have set up the conditions for failure. Strong katabatic winds then gradually lowered more snow above the tent until the weak layer gave way. The researchers estimated that the delay between the slope cut and the slab release could plausibly have been about 7.5 to 13.5 hours, matching the broad forensic window. And suddenly the story began to make brutal sense. Imagine the hikers sleeping or resting inside the tent. They have already spent hours in extreme cold. They have carved into the slope to level the campsite. Outside, the wind continues transporting snow. The mountain is changing above them, but not loudly enough to warn them. Then, sometime after midnight, a compact slab of snow breaks loose above the tent and slams into it. Not enough to bury them forever on the spot, but enough to deform the shelter, crush open part of the interior, inflict severe injuries on some of the people inside, and make them fear that worse collapse is seconds away. That would explain the knife cuts from inside. It would explain the rushed escape without full clothing. It would explain why experienced hikers might move downslope rather than stay at the compromised camp. It would also explain why the event could leave less obvious evidence than the popular imagination expects from the word avalanche. Even the puzzling injuries become less impossible under this model. The Nature paper argued that a relatively small but dense slab, striking people who were lying on top of rigid skis and gear beneath the tent, could create severe chest and skull trauma without the usual pattern of massive external wounds. National Geographic later summarized how the researchers used computer simulations, supported in part by impact data, to show that a hard block of snow could generate the kinds of blunt force injuries seen in some of the hikers. Crucially, the study suggested these injuries may have been severe but not instantly fatal, meaning the group could still have tried to evacuate together. That last detail is important, because it preserves the humanity of the final hours. This was not necessarily a scene of madness. It may have been a scene of rescue. The current thinking proposed by avalanche researchers is that after the slab struck, the group cut themselves out of the tent and headed toward the tree line for relative shelter from the wind. Some members were likely hurt. Others were still mobile. They built a fire beneath the cedar. Some tried to recover, regroup, or navigate. At some point, 3 headed back uphill, perhaps to retrieve equipment from the tent. Others remained lowered down, possibly trying to improve shelter in the ravine. In this view, the final hours of the Dyatlov group were not chaotic irrationality, but a chain of difficult survival decisions under catastrophic conditions. And yet, even this stronger scientific theory does not explain absolutely everything. That is why the mystery endures. The state of undress among some victims remains unsettling, though hypothermia can produce paradoxical undressing and confusion in extreme cases. The missing eyes and tongue have fueled endless supernatural speculation, but later explanations have pointed to postmortem decomposition and scavenger activity, especially for bodies found much later in the ravine and stream environment. Some reports of radiation traces have also helped sustain conspiracy theories, though later discussion has suggested more ordinary explanations, including contamination from equipment or materials associated with the hikers. None of these side questions has been fully dramatic proofed in the public mind, which is one reason the case still feels open even when the main trigger may now be better understood. The new work did not stop in 2021 either. In 2022, follow-up reporting in the same Nature family journal described additional expeditions and observations supporting the idea that the region is avalanche-prone. The authors wrote that subsequent visits confirmed the slopes above the tent location were steep enough for slab avalanches and reported direct evidence of fresh slab avalanches observed there under similar winter conditions. Those findings matter because one of the old anti-avalanche arguments had always been that terrain simply does not slide. Follow-up work undercut that certainty. That is why the title's phrase "new theories" is exactly right, because the modern shift in the Dyatlov story is not from mystery to total certainty. It is from wild invention to constrained plausibility. Today, the strongest explanation is no longer something unearthly happened. It is that a rare chain of natural events happened in exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong time to a highly competent group who could not have predicted it. That may sound less glamorous than spies or monsters, but it is, in its own way, far more terrifying, because it means the mountain did not need a conspiracy. It only needed physics, darkness, wind, snow, injury, and one series of decisions made under unimaginable pressure. 2024 Science History Institute piece captured why the case still grips people. The modern science has made the avalanche explanation more persuasive, but the incident remains emotionally potent because of the gruesome way the hikers were found and the decades of myth built around them. National Geographic also emphasized that the SLAP avalanche model does not claim to explain every final detail, only to provide the best evidence backed account yet of what set the tragedy in motion. In other words, science may have illuminated the trigger without fully recreating every minute that followed. And maybe that is the real shape of the Dyatlov Pass story. Not a perfect closed case. Not the supernatural riddle. Not proof of a secret war in the snow, but a partially reconstructed disaster. A freak convergence of terrain, weather, and human vulnerability that later generations mistook for something more exotic because the plain truth of it felt too cruel to accept. After all, there is something emotionally easier about blaming aliens, secret weapons, or hidden enemies. Those at least give the dead a dramatic opponent. The avalanche model gives them something colder, bad luck on a specific slope under a rare combination of conditions. And still, the mountain keeps some of its silence. We do not know the exact words spoken inside that tent. We do not know who cut first. We do not know who insisted they move downhill, who tried to hold the group together, who was injured first, or who last believed they could still reach the tent again. What we do know is that the evidence of the scene that cut tent, the trail to the trees, the fire, the bodies in stages, the ravine dead, the injuries, the cold is no longer as impossible to read as it once seemed. The strongest recent theories suggest the night began not with murder or madness, but with a delayed snow slab event and the desperate choices it forced. That does not make the story smaller, it makes it sadder, because in this version, the 9 hikers were not overtaken by something theatrical. They were overtaken by a mountain behaving just strangely enough to destroy them, and by weather system violent enough to turn every survival decision into a narrow corridor with no safe exit. So when people ask why the Dyatlov Pass has been solved, the fairest answer is this. The best modern evidence points strongly toward a natural explanation centered on a small delayed slab avalanche, wind-driven snow loading, severe cold, and unpredictability. But the exact final sequence remains partly inferential, because the only people who knew what truly happened on the slope died there. And perhaps that is why the story still works so powerfully in voiceover, because it lives in the narrow space between knowledge and loss. We know enough now to imagine the night more clearly than ever before, but not enough to remove its sorrow, not enough to restore the missing ears, not enough to silence the mountain completely. The Dyatlov Pass Incident remains one of the most haunting wilderness tragedies of the 20th century, not because it is pure mystery, but because it is almost explainable. Almost. A tent cut open from within. 9 figures moving downslope into black gold. A fire beneath the cedar. 3 bodies on the way back. 4 more under deep snow. And a mountain that, even after science has spoken more clearly, still keeps the last few minutes for itself.